Hello everyone, it's Mr. Nobody, and I am bringing you a little bit of a great literature reading today and a little bit of a book review. And this is a book that for a long time, especially I think when I was in high school, this is probably, I would have said, that's my favorite book. And it's C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. This book, which is actually pretty short and easy to read, gave me a lot to think about in high school and a lot to build from as I moved into college. It's a funny book because it's basically a criticism of an English textbook. So you should know C.S. Lewis was a teacher, and so part of what he dealt with in his life was teaching students as well as the texts that were used to teach students. And he came upon a book which he calls the Green Book, and he conceals what it actually is and who its authors are. He's really, really, really unhappy with it because he sees in it a philosophy that greatly disturbs him. And so the book, in its own way, is very simple. It only has 3 chapters: Men Without Chests, The Way, and The Abolition of Man. And so the first of these is basically he's saying, you see this textbook, you're not seeing what they're doing in this textbook. They're trying to... They're not just engaging in literary criticism, they're engaging in a kind of philosophical criticism that is a skepticism about so much of the nature of life as such. Now, in his case, he's dealing with what we might think of as modernists, but today you might be more likely to encounter postmodernists. It's a very much deconstructivist approach to things. Both positions are in opposition to this sort of classicist approach. And there's a certain amount of just debunking that's going on. I'd say the first bit, Men Without Chests, he's saying they're not just teaching students to read literature, they're teaching them to dissect it like a corpse and to debunk every bit of reality and real human feeling and every bit of, the sense of the actual connection with reality and the claims that higher realities Lewis really did believe in, like beauty as a real reality and goodness and truth. And we're going to debunk all the connections to that. So whatever anyone has to say, we can just take it apart. And the modernists did that as well as the postmodernists. So first, to get you into the argument of the first chapter, he goes through some situations, the type of questions and passages in their book, the reflections on it. And his big thing that he's trying to point out is that they're not so much engaging in literary criticism as they are engaging in a philosophical criticism. Like, there is a huge ideology baked into what they are saying. There are gigantic assumptions, and that's really what they're teaching. They are teaching the practical business of literary criticism, but it's really just the practice of a certain ideology and philosophy. And he calls the two authors Gaius and Titius in order to conceal their actual identities. And I'm going to just read you a little section from that first chapter. I doubt whether Gaius and Titius have really planned, under cover of teaching English, to propagate their philosophy. I think they have slipped into it for the following reasons. In the first place, literary criticism is difficult, and what they actually do is very much easier. To explain why a bad treatment of some basic human emotion is bad literature is, if we exclude all the question-begging attacks on the emotion itself, a very hard thing to do. And I think if you were around today to see how much of literary criticism is really just philosophical criticism, because it's a whole lot easier to do, he would nod and say, yes, this is the logical progression. Gaius and Titius have indeed become the model for all modern work. Even Dr. Richards, who first seriously tackled the problem of badness in literature, failed, I think, to do it. To debunk the emotion on the basis of a commonplace rationalism is within almost anyone's capacity. Or to us, say you can, we take whatever someone is saying and we just deconstruct it in terms of like their motivations or, whatever the popular literary critical theory is. As I said, it's a question begging. But it's very easy to do. Once you have the formula, such as the let's find the racism, whatever your particular popular theory is in your in your literary circle is, it's very easy to apply it to everything. Anyway, in the second place, I think Gaius and Titius may have honestly misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They've learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify the minds of young people against emotion. And maybe today that's in some ways reversed. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every pupil who needs to be guarded from weak excess of sensibility, there are others who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And maybe today it's a little bit of both, frankly. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. And I think that is a very big historical explanation. So that is part of what I would say is the failure of modernism. Modernism tried to set things up in a certain way and thought it could fix things, and all it did was pave the way for postmodernism. All it did was starve famished nature and make things easier for the propagandist, which is postmodernism for sure, because it believes that there is nothing but propaganda. There is nothing but propaganda. So postmodernism is the propagandist. And so he's already seeing it coming in the things that are happening to him at this point. And there's a sense in which both of them are reliant on a very relativistic worldview. One which just says it's all propaganda, so just propagandize things the way that seems best to you. And the other is this more modern constructivist, we can make things whatever we want them to be, we can inculcate them. But both would be very skeptical of what C.S. Lewis gets to in the next chapter, which he calls the way, or the Tao, which is his way of encapsulating the idea of this idea of transcendent moral law that is just baked into the universe, that all humans everywhere look at and see commonly across cultures. They look and they just say, there is a moral law there. We've argued about it, we discuss it, but we all agree that it's there. There is some transcendent reality of good and beauty and truth that we're trying to figure out. Whereas both modernism and postmodernism are thoroughly skeptical in their own ways. Nevertheless, they engage in a lot of work to try and force people to their positions. And so he talks also then about the irony of that. He says, there is a third and profounder reason for the procedure which Gaius and Titius adopt. They may be perfectly ready to admit that a good education should build some sentiments while destroying others. They may endeavor to do so, but it is impossible that they should succeed. Do what they will, it is the debunking side of their work, and this side alone, which will really tell. So by this, he's really saying, this is his own speculation, he's saying that what the students will really get from all this is the philosophical attitude, not really the understanding, because they're not really understanding the subjects, they're just learning to apply this critical, philosophical, ideological formula to them. So what they will come away from it will not be actual understanding of literature. They'll come away with the debunking itself, the skepticism, the deconstruction, is more what we engage in these days, the, destabilizing structures, all the things that we're told is what we're supposed to be doing. So he said that's what people are going to take from this. This is the thing that's going to last. And holy cow, was he 100% right. That was what lasted. The scholarship at the time, not so much, but the strategy of deconstructing, that really caught on and lasted. So, in order to grasp this necessity, clearly I must digress for a moment to show that what may be called the educational predicament of Gaius and Titius is different from that of all their predecessors. Until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believe the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that the object did not merely receive but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. So he's saying there was a general belief in moral realism. The reason why Coleridge agreed with the tourist who called a waterfall sublime and disagreed with the one who called it pretty was, of course, that he believed inanimate nature to be such that certain responses could be more just or ordinate or appropriate to it than others, and he believed correctly that the tourist thought the same. The man who called the cataract sublime was not intending simply to describe his own emotions about it. He was also claiming that the object was one which merited those emotions. But for this claim, there would be nothing to agree or disagree about. To disagree with "this is pretty" if those words simply described the lady's feelings would be absurd. If she had said, "I feel sick," Coleridge would hardly have replied, "No, I feel quite well." I love that argument. That's a brilliant argument. It's very much taking down the idea that these people who are even pushing this idea of the unrealism of statements, that they're just statements about ourselves or about a system or a reference to our own feelings, cannot themselves actually be engaging in that when they do that. Like, that's silly, obviously. We can disagree about whether something's right or wrong, but to say that that's the case is actually quite silly. When Shelley, having compared the human sensibility to an Aeolian lyre, goes on to add that it differs from a lyre in having a power of internal adjustment, whereby it can accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them, he assumes the same belief, that you attune your feelings to respond properly to the objects, and that there actually is a proper response to certain objects, that there is, in a sense, a right feeling, a right moral feeling, a right aesthetic feeling, a right epistemological feeling, truth instinct. "Can you be righteous," asked Traherne, "unless you be just in rendering to things their due esteem? All things were made to be yours, and you were made to prize them according to their value." St. Augustine describes virtue as ordo amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind and degree of love which is appropriate to it. So again, as I said, an idea of right moral feeling, which is very much, as he argues, a very common belief that was only more recently discarded from. But as he goes on to argue here, not really discarded, just supposedly, just on the face of it, discarded. Aristotle says the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has thus been trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics, because those principles will then explain and explore and give you understanding for that which your heart has been trained to respond to intuitively and by education. But for the corrupt man, these principles will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. So you can't learn to do ethics if you yourself have no love of good or ill. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. In the Republic, the well-nurtured youth is one who would see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-made works of man or ill-grown works of nature, and with a just distaste would blame and hate the ugly even from his earliest years, and would give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. All this before he is of an age to reason, so that when reason at length comes to him, then, bred as he has been, he will hold out his hands in welcome and recognize her because of the affinity he bears to her. So, and this is a position that almost no one would hold in education nowadays, because it's very much a moral realist sort of position. Although, as I said, he will argue that actually they do hold it. In early Hinduism, that conduct in man which can be called good consists in conformity to, or almost participation in, the rta, that great ritual or pattern of nature and supernature, which is revealed alike in the cosmic order, the moral virtues, and the ceremonial of the temple. Righteousness, correctness, order, the rta is constantly identified with satya, or truth, correspondence to reality. As Plato said that the good was beyond existence, and Wordsworth thought that though through virtue the stars were strong, so the Indian masters say the gods themselves are born of the rta and obey it. The Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao. It is the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is nature, it is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. And so he says he's just going to refer to this idea, which is common across so many cultures. And I myself in grad school wrote about a similar connection to Nahuatl philosophy and also Yoruba philosophy, how you even jump into these other continents and cultures where, for one, things are all recorded, the philosophy is all recorded through art, and through another one, it's all through oral storytelling and word pictures and things like that, and you still get this same idea. You find it again. You just find it again and again and again. And so C.S. Lewis says, I'm just going to call it the Tao. You know, this common belief in the way. So, as he says, there is some difference. He says, some of the accounts of it which I have quoted will seem perhaps to many of you merely quaint or even magical, but what is common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. And this is the fundamental dispute between all of these philosophies that he groups together, and both modernism and the as unyet developed postmodernism, which does not accept that key statement. They are non-objectivist. They are relativist, various other kinds of beliefs, but at least you can say they're non-objectivists. Those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. I myself do not enjoy the society of small children. Because I speak from within the Tao, I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind. And because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical, but they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. And if you look at theories of emotion, there's a sense in which emotion is basically, you have conscious thought and you look at things and you understand things, but you can't always be thinking completely about everything all the time. So you build this heuristic, which gives you the instinctive response that has the built-in analysis. And that goes down into your subconscious and becomes a kind of emotional response. And then sometimes you have cases where it's like, whoa, you got a messed up emotional response. You've got a terrifying, crippling fear for something that really isn't reasonable. Well, we need to pull that up out of the unconscious into the conscious. We need to work on it, fix it, get it more so it's actually trained appropriately to its objects, and then resubmerge it. So emotions in some way are, it's not that they're illogical, as he says. They are reasonable or unreasonable because they are heuristics. They do have a sensibility or unsensibility to them, and they have a real function too. They really have a purpose, and a valuable purpose, so that you can very quickly respond to things in the way that is appropriate to respond to them, as things that are good to move towards or things that you should be careful about moving towards. So, as we go on, they can be unreasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. Over against this stands the world of the Green Book. In it, the very possibility of a sentiment being reasonable or even unreasonable has been excluded from the outset. It can be reasonable or unreasonable only if it conforms or fails to conform to something else. To say that the cataract is sublime means saying that our emotion of humility is appropriate or ordinate to the reality, and thus to speak of something else besides the emotion, just as to say that a shoe fits is to speak not only of shoes, but of feet. But this reference to something beyond emotion is what Gaius and Titius exclude from every sentence containing a predicate of value. So they're completely skeptical about statements of value as objective statements. Such statements for them refer solely to the emotion. Now, the emotion, thus considered by itself, cannot be either in agreement or disagreement with reason. It is irrational, not as a paralogism is irrational, but as a physical event is irrational. It does not rise even to the dignity of error. On this view, the world of facts without one trace of value and the world of feelings without one trace of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice, confront one another, and no rapprochement is possible. So this is something that I've talked about in other places where there really isn't any discussion to be had if you truly take on this unrealist view of things, because there isn't any common ground, there isn't any common object to which to attach and have the discussion. There's ultimately only a battle. There's only a struggle. There's only expressions of my emotion versus expressions of your emotion. And of course, that's exactly what postmodernist theory says, that everything is just propaganda, in the simplest, barest sense. This is also the foundation for there's a sense in which everything is equal. Everything is equally right, everything is equally valuable, and that's why these objectivist statements are so completely hateful, because as he says, it can't be reconciled. The wonderful egalitarianism of irrealism cannot in any way be reconciled with the oppressive confinement of value realism. The two can't meet, they're in opposition. And so now I just want to move on to the next chapter, the chapter The Way, about the Tao. And I just want to read you how strong his opening statement is. He says, "The practical result of education in the spirit of the Green Book must be the destruction of the society which accepts it." It's a pretty strong statement. But this is not necessarily a refutation of subjectivism about values as a theory. So, he's saying his belief is that if this is the educational philosophy you pursue, ultimately, however long it takes, and there are many elements which he talks about that resist it in us, this would destroy your society. He says just because it would destroy your society doesn't necessarily mean that that's refutation of subjectivism about values as a theory. That's something you have to tackle on other grounds. And this is where he gets interesting. So this is where he criticizes the actual subjectivism of these teachers, where he basically says subjectivism as a practice, as a literary practice, doesn't really hold up under its own weight because you're clearly doing something. So I'll just read to it and I think you'll understand. "However subjective they may be about some traditional value, Gaius and Titius have shown by the very act of writing the Green Book that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective at all. And I have to say, for all the words and effort that is put in debunking things or criticizing things or deconstructing things in modern academia, and this is everywhere now, especially in modern teaching of literature, there's clearly something they're not subjective about, or they wouldn't put so much darn time and effort into it and be so strident and passionate about it. They write in order to produce certain states of mind in the rising generation, if not because they think those states of mind intrinsically just or good, yet certainly because they think them to be the means to some state of society which they regard as desirable. It would not be difficult to collect from various passages in the Green Book what their ideal is. But we need not. The important thing is not the precise nature of their end, but the fact that they have an end at all. They must have, or their book, being purely practical in its intention, is written to no purpose. And this end must have real value in their eyes. To abstain from calling it good, and to use instead such predicates as necessary or progressive, would be a subterfuge. They would be forced by argument to answer the questions: necessary for what? Progressing toward what? Effecting what? In the last resort, they would have to admit that some state of affairs was, in their opinion, good for its own sake. And this time, they could not maintain that good simply described their own emotions about it. For the whole purpose of their book is to so condition the young reader that he will share their approval. And this would be either a fool's or a villain's undertaking, unless they held that their approval was in some way valid or correct. In actual fact, Gaius and Titius will be found to hold, with complete uncritical dogmatism, the whole system of values which happened to be in vogue among moderately educated young teachers of the professional classes during the period between the two wars. I really like that point of his, because as much as you hear people arguing, oh, I'm just taking it apart, I'm not bringing anything to the table, he completely shoots the feet out from under that argument. And that's something I've had to always keep in my mind when you're getting into arguments with people, to think they don't have to defend the same sort of position. Like, they're not holding a position. There isn't something they have to defend. They aren't, in their own way, just as dogmatic and uncritical about whatever it is that they're bringing to the table as their ideology, and that you need to uncover it and bring it out and put it on a level and let the two then be discussed. Their skepticism about value is on the surface. It is for use on other people's values. About the values current in their own set, they are not nearly skeptical enough. And this phenomenon is very unusual. A great many of those who debunk traditional, or as they would say, sentimental, we probably wouldn't use that word today, we'd use something else, but traditional values, have in the background values of their own which they believe to be immune from the debunking process. They claim to be cutting away the parasitic growths of religious sanction and inherited taboos in order that real or basic values may emerge. I will now try to find out what happens if this is seriously attempted. Now, I'm not going to go into the particular example he gives, because it's an example that would have had a lot of cultural currency at the time, because we're in that interwar period. And the question is, why fight and die for your country? And these days, that's, although it may prove to be relevant at some point, it's a less relevant cultural question. It's not the big thing we discussed, although he does bring up, sexual morality is something of to be debunked, to be reconstructed, that it's something similar, and that the appeals that are made for it have to do with instinct, that things, how do we actually set up some because you need some system of authority to approve something and not another thing. And he says, well, as far as I can tell, it's an argument for instinct. Whatever is just felt deeply and most instinctively and strongly, these are the highest values. These are the real things. These are the true things that we've excavated. But he gets down into some of the philosophical difficulties of that. And he says, well, the innovators think that it's all going to work out. They'll get everything they want and nothing they don't want. In reality, we have not advanced one step. I will not insist on the point that instinct is a name for we know not what. To say that migratory birds find their way by instinct is only to say we don't know how migratory birds find their way. For I think it is here being used in a fairly definite sense, to mean an unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given species. In what way does instinct, thus conceived, help us to find real values? Is it maintained that we must obey instinct, that we cannot do otherwise? But if so, why are green books and the like written? Why this stream of exhortation to drive us where we cannot help going? Why such praise for those who have submitted to the inevitable? Why do you need to put so much effort into pushing a value if that is, in fact, just the inevitable course of instinct in nature? Or is it maintained that if we do obey instinct, we should be happy and satisfied? The very question we are considering was that of facing death, which, so far as the innovator knows, cuts off every possible satisfaction. And if we have an instinctive desire for the good of posterity, then this desire, by the very nature of the case, can never be satisfied, since its aim is never achieved, if at all, when we are dead. It looks very much as if the innovator would have to say, not that we must obey instinct, nor that it will satisfy us to do so, but that we ought to obey instinct. But why ought we obey instinct? Is there another instinct of a higher order directing us to do so, and a third of a still higher order directing us to obey it? An infinite regress of instinct? This is presumably impossible, but nothing else will serve. From the statement about psychological fact, I have an impulse to do so-and-so, we cannot by any ingenuity derive the practical principle, I ought to obey this impulse. Even if it were true that men had a spontaneous, unreflective impulse to sacrifice their own lives for the preservation of their fellows, it remains a quite separate question whether this is an impulse they should control or one they should indulge. For even the innovator admits that many impulses, those which conflict with the preservation of the species, have to be controlled. And this admission surely introduces us to a yet more fundamental difficulty. Telling us to obey instinct, basically, it's this argument that feeling, impulse, instinct, whatever is my nature, whatever is the thing which I identitize to, there are many voices which speak inside us, and we identitize to them. We take one of them and we say, this is what I am. This is a ruling God for me. This is authority. And I cannot but follow that authority. And its power is the power of just its compulsion against me. And then he says, well, why? Why should you have to? Why should you have to? Because some other instinct tells you that you should have to? And then here's the further problem is people aren't that simple. Telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. People say different things. So do instincts. Our instincts are at war. If it is held that the instinct for preserving the species should always be obeyed at the expense of other instincts, whence do we derive this rule of precedence? How do you decide? What instinct is in charge of deciding the order between the different instincts and which ones you should follow and which ones you shouldn't, since there's disagreement and conflict among them? To listen to that instinct, speaking in its own cause and deciding in its own favor, would be simple-minded. Each instinct, if you listen to it, will be claimed to be gratified at the expense of all the rest. That is 100% true, especially if you study things like emotional theory and emotional reactions. You can conceive of these different instincts almost like sub-personalities within you. And often when they arise, when the situation comes that calls them forth, they try to take over the entire structure. Like when you're angry, anger insists, I should be everything. I am being deprived and resisted and harmed by not being allowed to be everything. All of them are very dictatorial. There is a totalistic element to instinct and emotion. And so what do you even call the things that try to moderate between them, between those multiplicity of assertions of pure dictatorship? By the very act of listening to one rather than the others, we have already prejudged the case. If we did not bring to the examination of our instincts a knowledge of their comparative dignity, we could never learn it from them, and that knowledge itself cannot be instinctive. The judge cannot be one of the party judged. Or, if he is, the decision is worthless, and there is no ground for placing the preservation of the species above self-preservation or sexual appetite. Now, this last paragraph is a little more philosophically technical, so I'll try to read it slowly to try and get the summing up clear. The idea that, without appealing to any court higher than the instincts themselves, we can yet find grounds for preferring one instinct above its fellows dies very hard. We grasp at useless words. We call it the basic, or fundamental, or primal, or deepest instinct. It is of no avail. Either these words conceal a value judgment passed upon the instinct, and therefore not derivable from it, or else they merely record its felt intensity, the frequency of its operation, and its wide distribution. So you're just making an emotional statement. If the former, the whole attempt to base value upon instinct has been abandoned. If the latter, these observations about the qualitative aspects of a psychological event lead to no practical conclusion. It is the old dilemma. Either the premise is already concealed and imperative, or the conclusion remains merely in the indicative. And now I'll give you his sort of argument, skipping ahead a little bit, where he's basically saying all of these arguments that Gaius and Titius are engaging in are tacitly pulling their the strength of their arguments and even their reason for existing, for putting in the effort of arguing for something from the Tao, from this belief that you can't engage in this kind of moral argumentation, even as a kind of skepticism, without unwittingly serving the master that you are in fact rejecting. All the practical principles behind the innovator's case for posterity or society or the species are there from time immemorial in the Tao, but they are nowhere else. Unless you accept these without question as belonging to the world of action what axioms are to the world of theory, you can have no practical principles whatever. You cannot reach them as conclusions. They are premises. You may, since they can give no reason for themselves, of a kind to silence Gaius and Titius, regard them as sentiments. But then you must give up contrasting real or rational value with sentimental value. All value will be sentimental, and you must confess, on pain of abandoning every value, that all sentiment is not merely subjective. You may, on the other hand, regard them as rational. Nay, as rationality itself, as things so obviously reasonable they neither demand nor admit proof. But then you must allow that reason can be practical, that an ought must not be dismissed because it cannot produce some is as its credential. If nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Similarly, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing is obligatory at all. Which is a little bit like if God does not exist, all things are permitted. Like, absent some undergirding reality to ought and value statements, then there's just nothing to say about it really at all. And to some degree, while being hypocritical in doing so, this is, in a way, the argument of postmodernism, to say, well, that is all that is going on. We're all just screeching at each other. Fighting to be heard the loudest. To some it will appear that I have merely restored under another name what they always meant by basic or fundamental instinct, but much more than a choice of words is involved. The innovator attacks traditional values, the Tao, in defense of what he first supposes to be, in some special sense, rational or biological values. But we have seen all the values which he uses in attacking the Tao, and even claims to be substituting for it, are themselves derived from the Tao. If he had really started from scratch, from outside the human tradition of value, no jugglery could have advanced him an inch toward the conception that a man should die for the community or work for posterity. That is, if you've ever listened to Jordan Peterson talk about Nietzsche, he says that is the question of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is saying God is dead, which is basically God for him sort of means the Tao. And then Nietzsche saying, well, this is probably going to wreck our world pretty big. This was the biggest, most important thing that ever existed. You have no idea what the consequences are of this, or how long they're going to last, or how many centuries it's going to take to work out what it means, but it's going to be really bloody and destructive. And he was correct about that. And then he says, well, the only way out of it will be at some point we must figure out how to invent our own values ex nihilo, and that's where Jordan Peterson would step in and say, as far as I can tell, actually we can't do that. Like, our attempts to do that have just disintegrated into there's no basis that we have actually managed to come up with. And you get this postmodern unrealism. Nothing was ever actually advanced. Your sort of Enlightenment project failed and collapsed into postmodernism and will eventually degrade into more of a polytheism, where everyone just has their own gods that are their gods, and those gods will fight against each other, their own individual minor values, their own particular thing that they identitize with, that they glom onto and said, we are the people of this god, and my god shall now fight against yours in the pantheon. And all the gods are struggling. They're all 100% themselves. And this is something I've talked about, talking about the Greek myths before. Aphrodite only cares about Aphrodite's end. She doesn't care about the other things that happens, even if it brings about the ruin of an entire country. All she cares about is the fulfillment of Aphrodite's thing of, well, I want Paris and Helen to be together. I'm into that. So yeah, even if the war is about to end, I'm going to steal Paris away, and I'm going to overwhelm them with desire for each other. And even in the story, they're kind of humiliated by it, and they recognize the way we're being pushed around by the gods demand this ultimate devotion to them, and look at what it's doing to our world. It's making a wreck of it. It's going to burn the city to the ground. But we can't resist the compulsion of Aphrodite to be everything, to be the ultimate god, which is why the gods are all, to some degree, always fighting with each other, and humanity ends up getting caught and torn apart in the midst of it. So, if the Tao falls, all his own conceptions of value fall with it. Not one of them can claim any authority other than that of the Tao. Only by such shreds of the Tao as he has inherited is he even enabled to attack it. The question therefore arises, what title he has to select bits of it for acceptance and to reject others. For if the bits he rejects have no authority, neither have those he retains. If what he retains is valid, what he rejects is equally valid too. So let me just bring you to where he sums up. Since I can see no answer to these questions, I draw the following conclusions. This thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There never has been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems, as they now call them, ideologies, all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole, and then swollen to madness in their isolation. And if you listen to some of the other subjects I've talked about, yeah, 100%, that's where I stole that idea from. This idea of what is an ideology. It is the collapse of monotheism into polytheism, something that was contained and ordered within this larger system, being pulled out and then inflated into everything, becoming this terrible god. That's what an ideology essentially is. It's taking something that is less than everything and blowing it up to become everything. And he's saying, yeah, that's what ideologies are. So I will admit I stole that wholesale from this book. Although in my defense, I read this book so many times so long ago that until now, I knew I'd taken it from C.S. Lewis somewhere, but I didn't realize he'd put it quite that clearly. He put it exactly that clearly. And it has very much been my own position for the last 25 years. So, swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao, and to it alone such validity as they possess. If my duty to my parents is a superstition, then so is my duty to posterity. If justice is a superstition, then so is my duty to my country or my race. If the pursuit of scientific knowledge is a real value, then so is conjugal fidelity. The rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. The human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed of creating a new sun and a new sky for it to move in. So, and having said that, he does have to get into some of the complexities. I do want to briefly talk about that, and he does bring up some of this Nietzschean alternative, this idea of inventing values wholesale, that they're just something you create. So he says, the Tao admits development from within. There is a difference between a real moral advance and a mere innovation. From the Confucian, do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by, is a real advance. The morality of Nietzsche is a mere innovation. The first is an advance because no one who did not admit the validity of the old maxim could see reason for accepting the new one. And anyone who accepted the old would at once recognize the new as an extension of the same principle. So it's an outgrowth from the trunk. And you can have that within the Tao as we explore our knowledge and understanding of it. It is revealed to it that it grows from the trunk outwards. And you can see how each one builds and thickens and grows. So it is a real advance. It's not just a different tree. It's not just a different shoot. So if he rejected it, he would have to reject it as a superfluity, something that went too far, not as something simply heterogeneous from his own ideas of value. So there is a direct connection between the ideas within the Tao, he's saying. But the Nietzschean ethic can be accepted only if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error, and then to put ourselves in a position where we can find no ground for any value judgments at all. So cut down the whole tree to grow a different tree. There's a difference between the man who says to us, you like your vegetables moderately fresh, why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh? And a man who says, throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead. So that's his way of saying there is an internal unity, even to within different moral traditions within the Tao. There is actually a connection. There is a continuity. If you follow them back, they are all connected by their belief to this core trunk. Whereas these other things are saying, what about none of that and try eating a rock? He does then spend some time talking about what is good moral criticism, what is bad moral criticism, how do we avoid doing the wrong one, and how do we keep our mind on the right one. For example, how do we make sure that we're following the branch back to the trunk? Because he says you can engage in criticism, of course, along the branches, but when you're doing that, your goal is to follow the branch back to the trunk, to make sure everything connects properly, to make sure that things are growing the right direction as far as they should, that they're not becoming bent or... whereas he said, how do we have to be careful that we don't do that, versus saying there is no trunk. So there is some discussion of that. I'm not going to read that part right now. So the final section, which I'm going to read some from, is Chapter 3, The Abolition of Man. And he introduces it with a quote from John Bunyan. It came burning hot into my mind, whatever he said and however he flattered, when he had got me into his house, he would sell me for a slave. And this is part of the argument. If it's not clear, he's basically saying, well, what is the practical purpose of this approach to people? Like, what is really being done to us? What does depriving us of our connection to the Tao achieve? What does our burgeoning godhood as masters of nature really do? Are we really being set free? Because we imagine that we're being set free, that what we are achieving is the freedom and flourishing of the human race, and that this is something that people are saying, ooh, this is what's happening at this time, and now we've had about 100 years of it happening, and we thought everything was just going to flourish and just be better and better and more wonderful, that we would see from the disposal of the Tao, the natural beauty of the human spirit would emerge. To quote the way Theodore Dalrymple expresses it. That's how he put it, that we assumed that when we swept away this terrible old hegemony of the Tao, that the natural beauty of the human personality would just emerge like a flower, and how happy and wonderful everything would be. And he then spends some time documenting how, in fact, that hasn't been true at all. And so Lewis raises this question: in what sense is man the possessor of increasing power over nature? Let us consider 3 typical examples: the airplane, the wireless, meaning the radio, and the contraceptive. In a civilized community in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things. But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he's exercising his own proper or individual power over nature. If I pay you to carry me, I am not therefore myself a strong man. Any or all of the 3 things I have mentioned can be withheld from some men by other men, by those who sell, or those who allow the sale, or those who own the sources of production, or those who make the goods. What we call man's power is, in reality, a power possessed by some men, which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Again, as regards the powers manifested in the airplane or the wireless, man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor, since he is the target both for bombs and for propaganda. And as regards contraceptives, there is a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. By contraception, simply, they are denied existence. By contraception used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. Now, this is a sort of perspective that I could see someone like Russell Brand, who is always very much like, all of these things are really done to impoverish you, to take away your fundamental connection to reality, your fundamental authority and responsibility for your own life, and it's the attempt of technocrats or some other political elite to rule your life and determine what you should like, what you should esteem, what you should do, what you should value, and that the offense that some large companies and corporations take at their own fans rebelling against the things that they give them, which it is their duty to like, is an example of the powers and abilities of technology really just being wielded to give certain idealists, because they would say, well, we deserve it. We're the good people. Power over the destiny of mankind. To decide and, in fact, invent what they should approve or not approve. And this is a perspective that has, clouded my approach to things like technology, including things like social media, the internet. We just say, of course, we just assume everyone getting these things, that we are getting more powerful, that we are getting more, that we are increasing. And I just don't think it's quite so clear as that, because power over nature through the form of technology is not so simple. And C.S. Lewis is someone who did influence my thoughts on that. As he says, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific or social planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds over billions and billions. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on mankind's side. Each new power won by man is power over man as well. Each advance leaves them weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he's also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. And now this is something that could get confused, because this could lead to the same sort of postmodernist skepticism of just saying, well, that's all that it all is. Everything is just a conquest of us by each other. There is nothing else. In some sense, there is no nature. There is only how we wield the powers of nature against each other. And Lewis does include some distinctions to try and distinguish his way of looking at things from that perspective. I am not yet considering whether the total result of such ambivalent victories is a good thing or a bad. I'm only making clear what man's conquest of nature really means, and especially that final stage in the conquest, which perhaps is not far off. The final stage has come when man, by eugenics, which was a big idea at the time, ended up being a less of an idea, although we actually control reproduction far more than we ever did. But this idea is just ways of changing people, the ways we can change people through whatever knowledge we have. Psychology, medication, whatever means we use. By prenatal conditioning, by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, perfect educational practicum, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall have taken the thread of life out of the hand of Clotho, and be henceforth free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle will indeed be won. But who precisely will have won it? For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. In all ages, no doubt, nature and instruction have, in some sense, attempted to exercise this power. But the situation to which we must look forward will be novel in two respects. In the first place, the power will be enormously increased. Hitherto, the plans of educationalists have achieved very little of what they attempted, and indeed, when we read them, how Plato would have every infant a bastard nursed in a bureau, and Eliot would have the boy see no men before the age of 7, and after that no women, and how Locke wants children to have leaky shoes and no turn for poetry, we may well thank the beneficent obstinacy of real mothers, real nurses, and above all, real children, for preserving the human race in such sanity as it still possesses. So, as he says, the messiness of humankind, the unwillingness to submit to these overarching systems of complete state control have been what have preserved something of the human in us. But the man-molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique. We shall get at last a race of conditioners who really can cut out all posterity in what shape they please. The second difference is even more important. In the older systems, both the kind of man the teachers wished to produce and their motives for producing him were prescribed by the Tao, a norm to which the teachers themselves were subject, and from which they claimed no liberty to depart. They did not cut men to some pattern they had chosen. They handed on what they had received. They initiated the young neophyte into the mystery of humanity which overarched him and them alike. It was but old birds teaching young birds to fly. This will be changed. Values are now mere natural phenomena. Judgments of value are to be produced in the pupil as part of the conditioning. Whatever Tao there is will be the product, not the motive, of education. That's a really key sentence. Whatever Tao there is, whatever overarching system of value there is, will be the product, not the motive, of education. The conditioners have been emancipated from all that. It is one more part of nature which they have conquered or debunked. The ultimate springs of human action are no longer for them something given. They have surrendered. Like electricity, it is the function of the conditioners to control, not to obey them. They know how to produce conscience and decide what kinds of conscience they will produce. They themselves are outside and above. We are assuming the last stage of man's struggle with nature. The final victory has been won. Human nature has been conquered, and of course has conquered, in whatever sense those words may now bear. And now, an interesting thing is you might say, boy, well, you sure hate these people and think they'll be evil. Aren't you just unfairly assuming they'll be evil? Which, Lewis says, that's a silly question to ask. You're falling back on the whole Tao way of thinking of things. That is old thinking. So as he says, to some it will appear I am inventing a factious difficulty for my conditioners. Others, more simple-minded critics, may ask, why should you suppose they'll be such bad men? But I'm not supposing them to be bad men. They are, rather, not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Good and bad applied to them are words without content, for it is from them that the content of these words is henceforth to be derived. So these are the great the great intellectuals who shall make us, who shall teach us, who shall create us in the image that they choose. If you've read Thomas Sowell at all, this is all very much in keeping with the constrained and unconstrained visions. The innovators, the educators, he's saying in this particular age, they are very much of the unconstrained vision, that there are no constraints. We can make things be whatever they want to be. We are purely creative. We're like gods, and we particularly, who deserve that power, shall act that upon mankind, versus the constrained vision would very much fall in line with the idea of the Tao across many cultures. And then he also attacks the assumption that, well, of course we all want the same things. Like, if we completely unmoor ourselves from any idea of a overarching value system that has claims on all of us, it'll just be totally fine. Like, it'll all just work itself out. He's very skeptical about this. Says this difficulty is not fictitious. We might suppose that it was possible to say, after all, more of us want more or less the same things: food and drink and sexual intercourse, amusement, art, science, and the longest possible life for individuals and for the species. Let them simply say, this is what we happen to like, and then go on to condition men in the way most likely to produce it. Where's the trouble? But this will not answer. In the first place, it is false that we all really like the same things. But even if we did, what motive is to impel the conditioners to scorn delights and live laborious days in order that we in posterity may have what we like? Their duty? But that is only the Tao, which they may decide to impose on us, but which cannot be valid for them. If they accept it, then they are no longer the makers of conscience, but still its subjects, and their final conquest over nature has not really happened. The preservation of the species? But why should the species be preserved? One of the questions before them is whether this feeling for posterity, they know how it is produced, shall be continued or not. However far they go back or down, they can find no ground to stand on. Every motive they try to act on becomes at once a petitio. It is not that they are bad men. They are not men at all. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy people. They're not people at all. They're artifacts. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. And that makes me think of Dostoevsky and saying there's a bloody-mindedness in human that just says, we will not be piano keys. That's where he's saying, as I say, the subjects of the conditioners need not be unhappy, but they won't be human. Where he says, we can imagine a world, Dostoevsky says, where no one has anything to worry about but these very things that I mentioned, to eat and drink and amuse yourself and continue the species. And he just says, the first thing humans would do would be to smash that whole system just so something happens, just to prove that they aren't mere artifacts, that they aren't merely piano keys to be played by some unseen hand. And then Lewis goes on to say, well, what will be the new system? What will remain when you pull things apart, when you do turn men into artifacts? And he says the conditioners will act. When I said just now that all motives fail them, I should have said all motives except one. All motives that claim any validity other than that of their felt emotional weight at a given moment have failed them. That is very much a concept, our lived experience. Lived experience has become authoritative, and he's basically saying this is where it has to go. Any motive other than felt emotional weight fails. Everything except it has been explained away. But what never claimed objectivity cannot be destroyed by subjectivism. So subjectivism can't destroy felt lived experience because it never claimed to exist in any other realm. The impulse to scratch when I itch or to pull to pieces when I am inquisitive is immune from the solvent that is fatal to my justice or honor or care for posterity. When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. It cannot be exploded or seen through because it never had any pretensions. The conditioners, therefore, must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure. I'm not speaking here of the corrupting influence of power, nor expressing the fear that under it our conditioners will degenerate. The very words corrupt and degenerate imply a doctrine of value and are therefore meaningless in this context. My point is that those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse. We may legitimately hope that among the impulses which arise in minds thus emptied of all rational or spiritual motives, some will be benevolent. Now, these are, of course, the sort of arguments that would set Lewis in very much direct opposition to someone like Sam Harris. And you've seen these exact arguments continued between people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. These exact questions are part of what some of their debates have been about. I am very doubtful myself whether the benevolent impulses, stripped of that preference and encouragement which the Tao teaches us to give them, and left to their merely natural strength and frequency as psychological events, will have much influence. I'm very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside traditional morality and attained power, has used that power benevolently. I'm inclined to think that the conditioners will hate the conditioned. I believe that's a very interesting thing. The people who are operating upon the subjects, very likely to find them reluctant, recalcitrant, difficult, stupid, and develop a certain disdain and hatred for them. That is 100% something that you do see arising, this sort of contempt for the people that are being operated upon for their own good. Though regarding as an illusion the artificial conscience which they produce in us, their subjects, they will yet perceive that it creates in us an illusion of meaning for our lives which compares favorably with the futility of their own, and they will envy us as eunuchs envy men. But he says he doesn't insist on that. He says that's mere conjecture. I think the motivations for the resentment he might in fact be wrong about, but I think he was completely right. Well, and maybe he is right. Maybe there is a certain resentment for the simplicity there. But I think he's entirely right about that it's quite likely that you will end up with a hatred of the subjects upon which the masters operate. What is not conjecture is that our hope even of a conditioned happiness rests on what is ordinarily called chance. The chance that benevolent impulses may on the whole predominate in our conditioners. For without the judgment benevolence is good, that is, without re-entering the Tao, they can have no ground for promoting or stabilizing their benevolent impulses rather than any others. By the logic of their position, they must just take the impulses as they come from chance. And chance here means nature. It is from heredity, digestion, the weather, the association of ideas that the motives of the conditioners will spring. Their extreme rationalism, by seeing through all rational motives, leaves them creatures of wholly irrational behavior. If you will not obey the Tao, or else commit suicide, obedience to impulse, and therefore in the long run to mere nature, is the only course left open. At the moment, then, of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men, and those individuals subjected to that in themselves which is purely natural, to their irrational impulses. Nature, untrammeled by values, rules the conditioners, and through them all humanity. Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. Every victory we seem to win has led us, step by step, to this conclusion. All nature's apparent reversals have been but tactical withdrawals. We thought we were beating her back when she was luring us on. What looked to us like hands held up in surrender was really the opening of arms to enfold us forever. If the fully planned and conditioned world, with its Tao a mere product of the planning, comes into existence, nature will be troubled no more by the restive species that rose in revolt against her so many millions of years ago, will be vexed no longer by its chatter of truth and mercy and beauty and happiness. This is very much the classical argument tying into the quote from Bunyan at the beginning, that what can appear to be freedom is often just enslavement. Enslavement to the uncontrolled instincts, to the various beasts within you, which howl and bite and fight against each other, and whichever rawest can rise to the strongest, rather than some higher order which brings them all into harmony and cooperation, into which all are subject. It's this idea that if you won't submit yourself to the Tao, you will still be enslaved. That there isn't some other place for humanity to stand. There isn't some freedom outside of humanity, that to step outside the Tao is to step outside of humanity itself. It is actually to give up your freedom. It is to give up all structures. It is to give up all the ordering. So I'll just read a little more. We're coming close to the end of this. You're getting a quick view of this whole book. As soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, the whole process is stultified. For this time, the being who stood to gain and the being who has been sacrificed are one and the same. This is one of the many instances where to carry a principle to what seems its logical conclusion produces absurdity. Basically, by dissecting ourselves into an object of nature that we can merely act upon and take apart and build any way we want, we have actually also taken ourselves apart, and it becomes absurd. So, it is like the famous Irishman who found that a certain kind of stove reduced his fuel bill by half, and thence concluded that 2 stoves of the same kind would enable him to warm his house with no fuel at all. It is the magician's bargain. Give up our soul, get power in return. But once our souls, that is ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We shall in fact be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls. It is in man's power to treat himself as a mere natural object, and his own judgments of value is raw material for scientific manipulation to alter at will. The objection to doing so does not lie in the fact that his point of view, like one's first day in a dissecting room, is painful and shocking till we grow used to it. The pain and shock are at most a warning and a symptom. The real objection is that if man chooses to treat himself as raw material he will be. Not raw material to be manipulated, as he fondly imagined, by himself, but by mere appetite, that is, mere nature, in the person of his dehumanized conditioners. We have been trying, like Lear, to have it both ways, to lay down our human prerogative and at the same time to retain it. It is impossible. Either we are a rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or else we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasure of masters who must by hypothesis have no motive but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao provides a common law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. And that's a very key point. That's a point of the objectivists. How could you have a rule that isn't tyranny? If objective value doesn't exist, all rules are tyranny. And how can you have any obedience that is not slavery? If objectivism is false, all obediences are slavery. So as you said, it's that principle, it's that devotion that changes rules and obedience themselves into something other than tyranny and slavery, into something that is fair and common among all, that all are subject to, all can benefit from. You get the idea. And then Lewis feels he needs to kind of defend himself because he has been attacking modernism very much. He does want to say, well, I'm not attacking science as such. He actually says, I think their science could be a great help. Science is meant to be a great help. Science emerges for him from the understanding of the Tao, from this idea that there are things to discover, that there are these objective realities that will bring us knowledge, and that we can gain greater understanding. And he says, I'm not without hope that in fact science might bring us the solution to some of these problems, and that will in fact end up turning us back toward and giving us even more reason to understand and to value the things that the Tao handed to us. And I think that has, to some degree, depending on which scientists you follow, there has been some of that happening lately, where people are sort of rediscovering through science the sense behind things that had kind of been empirically discovered through the exploration of the Tao throughout cultures, throughout tens of thousands of years of human culture. And so Lewis says, well, what would this sort of science be? Like, what is, at least for that moment in time, what does he see as curative to the problems that they're having? And for him, it's the sort of deconstruction of the human person into its parts that he sees the problem. Today, we probably have other issues right now besetting science, but he's imagining it. And he says, this science that I could imagine, when it explained, it would not explain away. When it spoke of the parts, it would remember the whole. While studying the it would not lose what Martin Buber calls the thou situation. The analogy between the Tao of man and the instincts of an animal species would mean for it new light cast on the unknown thing, instinct, by the only known reality of conscience, and not a reduction of conscience to the category of instinct. Its followers would not be free with the words only and merely. In a word, it would conquer nature without being at the same time conquered by her, and buy knowledge at a lower cost than that of life. Perhaps I am asking impossibilities. Perhaps in the nature of things, analytical understanding must always be a basilisk which kills what it sees and only sees by killing. But if the scientists themselves cannot arrest this process before it reaches the common reason and kills that too, then someone else must arrest it. What I most fear is the reply that I am only one more obscurantist, that this barrier, like all previous barriers set up against the advance of science, can be safely passed. I think we can say that that barrier was passed, and it did not end up passing that safely, and that in fact, one of the side effects of it has actually been the progressive collapse of science and so much of the independence of legitimacy of it, that it has now become subject to capture. That's becoming a larger and larger problem, capture by social movements, capture by the state, capture by internal institutional imperatives and values, even things like just the economic need to publish, that science can be captured by that basic institutional incentive, and it can become a distorting element for it. So we're farther ahead in history than he's imagining, but he's not wrong about what he sees as the possibilities. And he defends this sort of like, hey, this could go badly. This could end up making us vulnerable. This could end up being a barrier we cross that is actually disastrous. This could actually make us more vulnerable to capture, not less. This could actually make science able to be conquered and taken rather than freeing it. He does defend himself against that accusation. He says, such a reply springs from the fatal serialism of the modern imagination, the image of infinite unilinear progression which so haunts our minds. Because we have to use numbers so much, we tend to think of every process as if it must be like the numeral series, where every step to all eternity is the same kind of step as the one before. I implore you to remember the Irishman and his two stoves. There are progressions in which the last step is sui generis, incommensurable with the others, and in which to go the whole way is to undo all the labor of your previous journey. I think we're certainly seeing that position now. To reduce the Tao to a mere natural product is a step of that kind. Up to that point, the kind of explanation which explains things away may give us something, though at a heavy cost. But you cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. And that's where we're going to end it for now. He does have a final section called the Illustrations of the Tao. I'm not going to go into that very much. That is my combined reading with some interjected thoughts. I hope you had some patience for them on this book. This is a book that informed my thinking a lot. As I said, you have to kind of set it in its historical context. It's not necessarily where we are now. It's someone looking at where things could go, and we're actually, 80 years on from that. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it. And there's still people very much pushing the original ideas in this, as well as what is the next evolution from these ideas. But we have still not recovered from the process that he talks about, that he sees happening, that he sees beginning and becoming popularized. We're very much right in the middle of it. We're in the next stage of it, but we are still very much in the middle of it. And there are people who are pushing back against it. And as I said, there's some people pushing back against it very much on the exact same terms. As I said, if you even just hear the debate between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris that was, I believe, moderated by Brett Weinstein, it tackles some of the same subjects that come up right in this book. But it's a great book. It's not a long book if you get a chance to pick it up. It's short, it's cheap, it's fun, you learn a lot from it. It's much more academic because it is about philosophies and ideologies, and it's particularly about education and the role that education plays in influencing our society. This is, in my opinion, a very important work on that and on what is being done, how it is being done, why it is being done. And it comes down to the level of something fairly pedantic, just the simple English textbook for like, middle form school children. It's like, oh, what great social engineering or philosophical or ideological, goings on could be happening as something as bland as that. And he'd say all kinds of stuff. They're taking apart the entire basis of the world that most of humanity has set as its central touchstone across all cultures throughout all of history. And you can do that in these most banal little ways of just how you ask someone to evaluate a passage from a reading. There is an immense amount you can pack into that. So if you have a chance, pick up the book and read it, but I hope you've gotten a good picture of what it's about. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.